Hello everyone. If you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
Mom, I don't want your God anymore. Mom, I don't want your God anymore. 7 words. Spoken in perfect, calm, terrifying English by my 7-year-old daughter, Lily. While she stabbed a chicken nugget with a plastic fork at our kitchen table in suburban Texas. And I just stood there, holding a bottle of ketchup, unable to answer. Not because I didn't love her, but because in that split second, I realized I didn't know how to say, "Please don't break my heart" in English without sounding like a grammar textbook. And that silence, that stupid frozen silence, almost destroyed everything I had built. So here is the thing nobody tells you about raising kids in America. And I need you to really hear me on this because I spent 3 years pretending I understood it before it finally cracked me open on a random Tuesday. In March. You see, back in my mother's kitchen, faith was not a conversation. It was the smell of incense at 5 in the morning. It was my grandmother's hands pressing together. It was the quiet hum of a prayer you never questioned because questioning it would be like questioning the sky for being blue. You just inherited it, like your last name, like your eye color, like the small scar on your left knee. But here, in this country, in this loud and bright and aggressively free country, a child can look you dead in the eyes over a plate of dinosaur-shaped nuggets and say, "Actually, Mom, I am opting out." And you are supposed to smile. You are supposed to say, "Okay, baby, that is your choice." And I learned that phrase, "that is your choice," in my adult ESL class on a Thursday evening, and my teacher, Mrs. Patterson, a retired woman from Vermont with reading glasses on a chain, told us it was the most American sentence in the English language. I laughed then. I am not laughing now. Because Lily said those 7 words and my husband Greg, who was sitting right there with his mouth full of rice, just nodded and said, "Fair enough, Lil," and I felt the floor tilt. I felt my mother's face appear in my mind, disappointed, tired, whispering in Vietnamese, "Con de no mat gok roy." I lost my roots. I let my daughter lose hers. And the worst part, the part one have never told anyone until this exact moment in this video, is that I went to the bathroom that night, locked the door, turned on the faucet so nobody would hear, and I cried in a language that was not English and not quite Vietnamese anymore. Some broken halfway language that belonged only to me. And I whispered to myself, very slowly, practicing like I was back in that ESL classroom, "It is okay. It is her choice." And I did not believe a single syllable. Not yet. But here is what happened the very next morning, because this is where the story gets strange, because Lily walked into the kitchen, looked up at me with those serious brown eyes she got from me, and said, "Mom, can you teach me your prayer? The one Grandma used to say? I want to decide for myself, but I need to hear it first." And I stood there, barefoot on cold tile, and I realized that letting her choose did not mean losing her. It meant she wanted to choose me. And I opened my mouth to speak, and what came out next changed the entire way this family believed, loved, and argued for the next 4 years. But I will get there. I promise. First, you need to understand how a woman who could barely order coffee in English ended up married to a man who talks to God in a language she still, after 11 years, cannot fully understand. And that story starts at a dinner table very different from this one, with a rule nobody warned me about, a rule so quiet, so invisible, that it took me 3 Thanksgiving dinners to even notice it was there. And once I saw it, I could never unsee it. And honestly, I am not sure I wanted to. The dinner table rule nobody warned me about. There is a rule in American families that nobody writes down, nobody explains, and nobody warns you about, and if you break it, nobody yells. They just go quiet. And that silence is so much worse than yelling. I learned this the hard way at my 3rd Thanksgiving with Greg's family in Dayton, Ohio. When I made the mistake of asking his 82-year-old grandmother, "So, do you pray every day?" And the entire table, 14 people, 14 forks, 14 pairs of eyes, just stopped. Mid-chew. Mid-sip. Mid-laugh. And his mother smiled this thin, polite, terrifying smile and said, "We don't really do that here, honey." And I sat there holding my fork, thinking, do what? I just asked a question. In my mother's house, asking someone about their prayer life was as normal as asking if they wanted more rice. But here is the thing I slowly figured out over the next 2 years of Sunday dinners and holiday breakfasts and backyard barbecues in this strange, sprawling American life I was building with Greg. Faith here is not a dish you pass around the table. It is not something you ladle into someone else's bowl and say, "Here, you need this, eat up." Faith is a drawer. A small, private, locked drawer inside your chest, and you only open it if you want to. And you only show people what is inside if you trust them with your whole life. Greg's dad, a tall, quiet man who fixed tractors for a living, once told me, very gently, while we were washing dishes together, "Sweetheart, the leaf is between a person and whatever is up there." And he pointed at the ceiling with a soapy finger. And I remember thinking, but what if I want to share it? What if my faith is the most important thing I own and I want to hand it to my children like a warm blanket? And he just rinsed a plate and said, "Then you hold it up and let them decide if they want to reach for it." And that sentence, that one slow sentence, took me 4 months to fully understand because I kept replaying it in my head at night while Greg snored beside me. Translating it from English to feeling, from feeling to memory. From memory to the kitchen in Vietnam where my grandmother never once asked me if I wanted to pray. She just lit the incense and I stood there because standing there was loving her. And I think that is the deepest difference. Not the words. Not the rituals. But whether love means handing someone a belief or handing them the space to find their own. And I did not hate this American way. Not exactly. But it scared me. Because if I let Lily open her own drawer one day, what if it was empty? What if she looked inside and found nothing of me in there? And I carried that fear like a stone in my pocket for a long time. But then Greg did something, one ordinary Wednesday night, something so small and so stupid and so completely him, that it cracked that stone right open. He was sitting on the living room floor with Lily, building a crooked Lego tower, and Lily asked him, very casually, the way kids ask about the weather, "Dad, does God have a last name?" And Greg did not laugh. He did not say, "That is a silly question." He set down his little blue Lego brick, looked at her with total seriousness, and said, "I honestly do not know, Lil. What do you think?" And I was standing in the doorway, holding a laundry basket, and something in my chest shifted. Because in my whole life, nobody had ever answered a faith question with another question. Nobody had ever said, "I don't know," and made it sound like an invitation instead of a failure. And I set the laundry basket down very quietly because I did not want to interrupt. But Lily looked up, saw me, and said, "Mom, come here. What do you think God's last name is?" And I opened my mouth. And what I said next made Greg laugh so hard he knocked the entire Lego tower over. But that is not the funny part. The funny part is what happened 3 weeks later, when I married this man in a tiny courthouse with no priest, no monk, no incense. And my mother's voice on a phone call from 9,000 miles away, saying one sentence in Vietnamese that I will never forget. And that sentence is the reason our wedding almost did not happen. I married a man who prays in a language I can't understand. Every single night, in our small 3-bedroom house outside of Austin, Texas, I turn left and Greg turns right. I close my eyes and press my palms together and whisper, "Nam Mo Ad De Fat," very softly, the way my grandmother taught me when I was 5. And Greg folds his hands, lowers his head, and talks to God like he is leaving a voicemail for a friend. 2 prayers. 2 directions. 1 bed. And for the first 2 years of our marriage, that 10-second gap between his amen and my final bow was the loneliest part of my entire day. Not because we were apart, but because we were together and still, somehow, speaking to different skies. And here is the thing about marrying someone who prays in a language you cannot fully understand. You start doing ridiculous translations in your head. Greg would say grace before dinner, eyes shut, murmuring fast, and I would sit there nodding like I understood every word while actually thinking. Okay, he said bread, he said thankful, he said something about Tuesday, and now he is wrapping up. And once, at a family barbecue, I accidentally said amen about 4 seconds too late. And Greg's cousin looked at me like I had just answered a phone call in the middle of a funeral. I wanted the ground to open and swallow me whole. But Greg just squeezed my hand under the table and whispered, "You were close enough, babe." And that tiny sentence, just close enough to keep reaching toward each other. And I learned that phrase in my English class the next week, and my teacher wrote it on the board and said, "This is not a phrase you will find in your textbook." And she was right. No textbook teaches you how to love someone whose sacred words sound like background music in a language you are still learning. But the hardest night, the night I almost could not take it anymore, was not about prayer. It was about a Tuesday in November when Lily, who was 4 then, crawled into bed between us at 2 in the morning. Grabbed Greg's hand with her left hand and my hand with her right, and said, "Can you both do your God thing at the same time? I want to hear them together." And Greg looked at me. And I looked at Greg. And neither of us moved. Because nobody had ever asked us to mix those 2 skies into one. And Greg finally whispered, "Sure, Lil." And he started his prayer and I started mine. And our voices overlapped in that dark bedroom, his low English rumble and my soft Vietnamese hum. and Lily fell asleep between them like a little bridge between two countries. And I cried silently into my pillow because it was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard and also the most terrifying. Because I realized that Lily was building something neither Greg nor I knew how to build. A third thing. A new thing. And I did not know if I was allowed to be proud of it or if I was supposed to be afraid. And I chose afraid. For a long time, I chose afraid. Until the school sent home that form. That stupid, simple, one-page form with a little checkbox and a sentence at the bottom in small, polite, bureaucratic font that read, "Religious preference, child's choice." And I held that paper in my kitchen at 6 in the evening, still in my work clothes, and my hands were shaking. Not because of what it said, but because for the first time, someone outside my family was telling Lily she could choose. And I realized I had no idea what she would pick. And I realized, even worse, that I might not be okay with whatever it was. And that night, I did not turn left. I did not pray. I just sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall, and Greg asked me what was wrong, and I said one word. One English word I had learned very recently, a word my teacher said Americans use when they are terrified but trying to sound fine. And that word was overwhelmed. And Greg sat down next to me and said, "Okay. Tell me everything." And I did. And what I told him made him go very, very quiet. And his silence, that night, was louder than any prayer. The school sent home a form that changed everything. A piece of paper. One single piece of paper, printed on cheap white stock. Folded into Lily's backpack between a juice-stained spelling worksheet and a drawing of a cat with 7 legs. And that piece of paper made me sit on my kitchen floor in suburban Texas at 6:15 on a Wednesday evening, still in my work shoes. Reading the same sentence 11 times because my brain kept refusing to translate it. Religious preference, child's choice. 4 words doing the work of a grenade. And I kept whispering them out loud, slowly, the way I practiced new vocabulary in my English class, child. Choice. Child. Choice. As if saying them enough times would make them mean something different. Something smaller. Something that did not feel like someone handing a 6-year-old a key to a door I had been guarding my entire life. And I need you to understand something here. I was not angry at the school. I was not angry at the teacher, Mrs. Delgado, a kind woman with paint-stained fingers who always drew little suns on Lily's homework. I was angry at the sentence itself. Because in my mother's house, in the house where I grew up, you did not choose your faith the way you choose a flavor of ice cream. You inherited it. You breathed it. It was in the walls, in the altar, in the smell of jasmine incense every morning at 5. You did not get a form. You did not get a checkbox. You got a grandmother's hand on your head and the words, "This is who we are." Full stop. No discussion. No opt-out. And I loved that. I loved the weight of it, the certainty, the feeling of being held inside something older and bigger than myself. And now some school district in Texas was printing a form that basically said, "Hey kid, actually, you get to decide." And my first thought, my ugly honest thought, the one I am almost ashamed to say out loud even now, was, but what if she decides wrong? And then immediately after that thought, a second one hit me harder. Who am I to say there is a wrong? And those two thoughts wrestled in my chest like two cats in a small room while I sat on the tile floor and Greg pulled into the driveway outside. And the headlights swept across the kitchen window. And I folded the form. I put it in my pocket. I stood up. I turned on the stove to reheat the pasta I had made that morning. And I decided, stupidly, selfishly, that I would just not fill it out. I would let it sit in my pocket. I would pretend it never existed. And for 3 days, that is exactly what I did. 3 days of pretending. 3 days of smiling at Lily over breakfast and saying, "How was school, baby?" while the form burned a small hole in my jacket pocket. And on the 4th day, Lily came home, dropped her backpack by the door, looked at me with those serious brown eyes, and said, "Mom, Mrs. Delgado asked if we turned in the religion paper. She said some kids picked church and some kids picked nothing and one kid picked aliens." And she laughed. She actually laughed. And then she looked at me and said, very gently, "Mom, what did you pick for me?" And I froze. Because the truth was, I had not picked anything. Because the truth was, I did not know how to pick for someone I loved more than my own breathing. And that night, after Lily was asleep, my phone rang. 11:43 p.m. The screen lit up with a name I had not seen in 2 weeks. My mother. And I almost did not answer. Almost. But I did. And the first thing she said was not hello. The first thing she said was, in Vietnamese, sharp and shaking, "Con dang de tue no mat gok roy." You are letting your children lose their roots. And I sat in the dark garage, in my pajamas, in the cold Texas November, and I could not speak. Not in English. Not in Vietnamese. Not in any language at all. And my mother waited. And the silence stretched. And then she said something else, something quieter, something that cut deeper than the accusation. She said, "Me so con quain duong vi na. I am afraid you will forget the way home." And I pressed the phone against my forehead and I whispered, "I'm still here, me." But even as I said it, I was not sure which home I was talking about anymore. And that question, that stupid beautiful question about which home is home, followed me into the next morning and into the fight that almost ended everything. My mother called and said I was losing my children. The worst sound in the world is not screaming. It is not breaking glass or thunder or a car alarm at 3 in the morning. The worst sound in the world is your own mother crying quietly on the other side of a phone screen, trying to hide it. Pressing her lips together so you will not notice, while you sit in a cold garage in Texas in your pajamas holding your breath. Pretending you cannot hear it. And I heard it. Every single tremor. Every swallowed breath. And she said, in Vietnamese, slow and deliberate, the way you say something you have been rehearsing for weeks, "Con oi, mi kong trait con. Mi chi so. So mot gay tue no nin con ma kong hu con la ai." My child, I do not blame you. I am only afraid. Afraid that one day your children will look at you and not understand who you are. And I whispered, they understand me, and she said, do they? Do they know your prayers? Do they know why you light incense on the 1st and 15th? Do they know the story of your grandmother's grandmother? And I had no answer. Because the truth was, Lily knew the word Buddha the way she knew the word dinosaur. A fact. A picture in a book. Not a warmth. Not a smell. Not a hand on her head at 5 in the morning. And I hung up the phone and I sat in that garage for 40 minutes. I counted. 40 minutes of cold tile and silence and the hum of the water heater. And during those 40 minutes, English left me. Not in a dramatic way. Not like a movie where you forget everything. Just quietly, like a radio losing signal. The words I had spent years building, the vocabulary lists, the verb tenses, the polite small talk I practiced in the mirror before work. All of it turned into static. Because what was the English word for the guilt of raising your children in a country that tells them they can choose, while your mother, 9,000 miles away, is terrified they will choose nothing? There is no word. I checked. I literally opened the dictionary app on my phone that night, sitting in the garage, and I typed in guilt and read the definition and thought, no. That is too small. That is a word for forgetting to return a library book. What I felt had no entry. And the next 3 days were a kind of fog. I made breakfast. I packed lunches. I drove Lily and her little brother, Sam, to school. I smiled at other parents in the pickup line and said, "Good morning, how are you?" In that bright automatic American voice my ESL teacher taught me, the one that means nothing and everything at the same time. And at night I stood in the kitchen and lit one stick of incense, just one. Hidden in the backyard behind the fence where the neighbors could not smell it, where Lily would not ask questions. Where I could close my eyes and be 5 years old again, standing next to my grandmother, not choosing, not deciding, just belonging. And Greg saw me once. He stood at the back door, watching, and he did not say anything. He just went back inside. And that hurt more than if he had spoken. Because I wanted him to ask. I wanted him to say, "What is that? Tell me. I want to know." But he gave me the American thing. The space. The drawer. The polite, respectful, devastating distance of a man who believes that love means not asking. And on the third night, I could not take the distance anymore. Lily was asleep. Sam was asleep. The house was quiet. And I walked into the bedroom and Greg was sitting on the edge of the bed reading, and I stood in the doorway and I said, very flatly, in English, "I need you to fight with me right now. I need you to not be polite. I need you to be angry. Because if you keep being respectful, I am going to lose my mind." And he put his book down. And he looked at me. And he said, "Okay. Tell me what you need me to be angry about." And I said, "The kids. Their faith. Whose it is. What we are doing. What we are not doing. All of it. Right now. Tonight. And he took a breath. And what he said next, calm and steady and absolutely infuriating, was, "They are not ours to give." And I felt the fight drain out of me like water from a cracked bowl. Not because he was wrong, but because he was right. And being right was the most maddening thing in the world. And I sat down on the bed and I said, "Then what do we do?" And he said, "We wait. We watch. We let them surprise us." And I wanted to scream. Because waiting is the hardest thing. And because 2 weeks later, Lily surprised us. And it was not what either of us expected. Not even close. The 2 a.m. fight about whether God has a last name. At 2 in the morning. In a house where both children were finally asleep and the only sound was the Texas wind dragging tree branches across the roof like slow fingernails. I screamed at my husband in English so broken it barely qualified as a language. You cannot just let him switch. He is 9. He does not know what he is doing. And Greg stood in the kitchen in his boxers and an old college t-shirt, holding a glass of water, completely still, watching me unravel. Because Sam, our quiet, serious 9-year-old, had announced at dinner that he did not want to go to church anymore. He wanted to try meditation. He had seen a video. He liked the breathing. He said it made his chest feel less loud. And Greg had said, "Okay, buddy, let's look into it." Just like that. Let's look into it. As if faith was a restaurant you could walk past and decide not to enter. And something in me snapped. Not gently. Not politely. The kind of snap where you hear the thread tear and you know you cannot stitch it back the same way. And I started talking fast, too fast, tripping over tenses, mixing up words. Saying he is not understanding the important instead of he does not understand the importance. Saying you are making him confuse instead of you are confusing him. And I hated myself for the errors even while they were leaving my mouth because I sounded like my first-year English self, fumbling and small. And Greg could hear it, he could hear me regressing, and he did not interrupt. He just stood there. And that stillness, that calm American stillness, that I am giving you space stillness, made me want to throw the glass of water at the wall. So I said, "Stop being quiet. Say something. Argue. Tell me I am wrong. Tell me I am right. Say anything." And he set the glass on the counter. And he said, very softly, "I do not think he is confused. I think he is 9 and he is trying things on. Like shoes. You do not scream at a kid for trying on shoes." And I said, "Faith is not shoes, Greg." And he said, "Maybe not. But forcing him into a pair that pinches is not teaching him to walk. It is just teaching him to limp quietly." And I stood there, mouth open, no English left, no Vietnamese left, no language left, just breathing. And the worst part was that he was right again. And being right at 2 in the morning in your boxers while your wife is crying broken grammar at you is not a victory. It is a loneliness. And he reached for me. And I stepped back. And he stopped. And we stood on opposite sides of the kitchen island like 2 countries sharing a border neither one wanted to cross. And he whispered, "I'm sorry. I don't know how to do this either." And that was the first time in our marriage he admitted that. And it should have helped. And it did not. Because the next morning, I walked Sam to the bus stop and he looked up at me and said, "Mom, is it okay if I just breathe instead of pray?" And I knelt down and I said, "Yes, baby. It is okay." And I meant it. Mostly. But then I drove to work and sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes before going in. And I called the one person I swore I would not call again about this. My neighbor, Karen, a loud, cheerful woman with 3 kids and a golden retriever, who had once told me over the fence, "Honey, I still don't know what I believe and I am 47. And I needed to hear that again. I needed someone to tell me that not knowing was not the same as losing. And Karen answered on the second ring. And she did not say hello. She said, "Oh, you finally called. I was wondering when you would." And then she said, "Come over tonight. Bring wine. My 10-year-old has something to tell you that will either make you feel much better or much worse. I genuinely cannot remember which." And I hung up and drove into work and sat at my desk and could not focus for 6 hours because all I could think about was what that 10-year-old boy was going to say. And what he said that evening, standing in Karen's backyard in grass-stained shorts, holding a half-eaten popsicle, was 5 words that rearranged every thought I had carried for 32 years. And I will tell you those 5 words. But first, you need to understand what happened in the 3 hours before I walked into that backyard. Because Greg called me at 4 in the afternoon and said one sentence that made me pull over on the highway. He said, "Lily wants to talk to you tonight. About God. And she wants to do it in Vietnamese." And I gripped the steering wheel and thought, she does not speak Vietnamese well enough. She barely knows the words. And then I thought, that is exactly the point. She wants to try. In my language. For me. And I pulled over and I cried in the parking lot of a Walgreens in Round Rock, Texas, next to the shopping cart return. While a man loading groceries into his truck pretended very politely not to see me. And when I finally drove home that evening, Karen was waiting on her porch with 2 glasses of wine and a grin. And she said, "Ready?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Good. That means you are paying attention." And we walked into the backyard. And her son, Tyler, looked up from his popsicle, looked me dead in the eyes, and said the 5 words. And the world tilted. Just slightly. Just enough. What my neighbor's kid taught me about belief. 5 words. Spoken by a 10-year-old boy with purple popsicle staining his chin and grass seeds stuck to his knees, standing in a backyard in Round Rock, Texas. Under a sky going orange, while his mother sipped wine on the porch pretending not to listen. And those 5 words undid 32 years of certainty in my chest like someone pulling a single thread and watching the whole sweater come apart in slow motion. Tyler looked at me, this small serious American boy, and said, "You don't have to know." And then he took another bite of his popsicle and went back to kicking a soccer ball against the fence as if he had not just handed me the one sentence no adult, no teacher, no priest, no monk, no grandmother, no mother had ever thought to give me. You don't have to know. 5 words. And I stood there holding my wine glass, and I felt something in my shoulders drop that I had been carrying so long I forgot it had weight. Because my whole life, the message was, you must know. You must choose. You must carry this forward. You must not lose it. And here was a child, a literal child in cargo shorts, telling me that the absence of an answer was not a failure. It was a Tuesday. It was a popsicle. It was the sky going orange and the soccer ball thumping against wood and the wind moving through the pecan trees and nobody, absolutely nobody, needing me to fill in the blank. And Karen watched me from the porch. And she did not say, "Are you okay?" She did not say, "Do you want to talk about it?" She just raised her glass a little and said, "He told me that when he was 7. Took me 3 years to actually hear it." And I laughed. A real laugh. The kind that comes up from your stomach and surprises you. And I said, "He is 10 now?" And she said, 10 3/4. And last month he told me he thinks God might be a really big question mark. And I said, "Cool, buddy, pass the butter." And I laughed again. And the sound of it, my own laugh in that backyard, sounded like a language I had forgotten I could speak. Not English. Not Vietnamese. Just relief. Just a human woman standing in grass realizing she had been holding her breath for a decade. And I drove home that night with the windows down, and the Texas air was warm and smelled like cut grass and gasoline. And I walked in the front door and Greg was on the couch reading and the kids were asleep and the house was quiet. And I sat down next to him and I said, "Tyler said something to me." And Greg looked up. And I told him the 5 words. And he was quiet for a long time. And then he said, "Maybe that is what I have been trying to say. Badly. For 2 years." And I leaned my head on his shoulder. And he kissed the top of my head. And we sat there in the quiet. And for the first time in months, the quiet was not a wall between us. It was a room we were both sitting in together. And I thought, okay. Maybe I do not have to know tonight. Maybe I do not have to translate my grandmother's incense into Greg's folded hands. Maybe I can just let them both exist in the same house without making them shake hands and agree. And that thought was so new and so fragile I was afraid to hold it too hard. But I did. I held it all the way to bed. And the next morning, I made a decision. A small one. A quiet one. The kind nobody notices from the outside. I decided that tonight, at bedtime, I would not translate my faith for Lily. I would not explain it or defend it or package it in clean English sentences she could nod at and forget. I would just tell her a story. Slowly. In the simplest words I had. And I would let the story be the prayer. And I had no idea what story I would tell. But I knew it had to be true. And I knew it had to have my grandmother in it. And I knew, with a small terrifying certainty, that whatever came out of my mouth tonight would change the way this family talked to each other forever. The night I stopped translating my faith for my kids, I walked into Lily's room that night with no plan, no script, no vocabulary list. And that terrified me more than any English exam I have ever sat in my entire life. Because at least an exam has an answer key. At least an exam tells you what is correct. And what I was about to do had no correct. It just had me, sitting on the edge of a twin bed with a dinosaur comforter, looking at my 7-year-old daughter. And deciding that for the first time I would not explain. I would not translate. I would not say, in Vietnamese, we call this prayer this, and it means this, and you should understand because it is important. I would just tell a story. Slowly. Simply. The way my ESL teacher Mrs. Patterson always said, use the words you have. The small ones. The true ones. So I took a breath. And I said, okay. So. There was a lady. A long time ago. She was very small. Smaller than me. She lived in a house with no air conditioning and one light bulb and a kitchen that smelled like fish sauce all the time. And Lily pulled the blanket up to her chin and watched me. And I said, every morning, before the sun was up, this lady would light a little stick. A thin little stick that made smoke. And the smoke smelled like flowers and dirt mixed together. And she would close her eyes. And she would talk. Not to me. Not to anyone in the room. Just up. Just into the smoke. And I never asked her what she said. And she never told me. And I think that was the point. And Lily whispered, what was her name? And I said, Ba Nagwai. Your great-grandmother. And Lily said, did she believe in God? And I said, I think she believed in the talking. I think the talking was the God part. And Lily was quiet for a long time. And then she said, does Dad do the talking too? And I said, yeah, baby. He does. His version of it. Every night. You just hear different words. And she nodded slowly, the way kids do when they are building something invisible behind their eyes. And then she said the thing I did not expect. She said, can I do both? Like, can I light the stick and do the talking? Can I mix them? And I felt my throat close. And I said, you can mix anything you want, Lily. You can make a brand new thing. Nobody will be mad. And she said, okay, very matter-of-factly, the way she says okay to being served broccoli. And she rolled over. And she fell asleep in about 90 seconds. And I sat on that bed for a long time after her breathing went deep and even. And I looked at the wall. And I thought, that was it. That was the whole sermon. No doctrine. No rule book. Just a stick of incense and a woman talking into smoke and a child deciding she could mix the smoke with something else if she wanted to. And I walked out of that room and Greg was leaning in the hallway, arms crossed, pretending he had not been listening. And he said, very quietly, how did it go? And I said, she wants to mix them. And he smiled. Not a big smile. A small one. The kind that says, I was hoping you would say that. And he put his arm around me and we walked back to our bedroom together. And I thought, okay. This works. This small, strange, imperfect thing works. And I slept better than I had in months. And for 3 weeks, everything was calm. Peaceful. Easy. And then Sam came home from school on a Thursday and said, "Mom, I don't want to mix. I just want to sit in the yard and watch the trees." Is that a religion? And I opened my mouth to answer. And before I could, Lily, who was sitting at the table doing homework, looked up and said, "That's not a religion, Sam. That's just being alive." And Sam said, "Okay, cool," and went outside. And I stood in the kitchen holding a wooden spoon and thought, my children are building a theology out of trees and smoke and silence, and I did not teach them any of it. And I did not know whether to feel proud or obsolete. And the answer, it turned out, was both. And that both followed me into the next 6 months, which were the strangest, quietest, most beautiful 6 months of my life, as 3 kids, one by one, started telling me exactly what they believed. And not one of them told me the same thing. And not one of them asked my permission first. And I had to decide, in real time, whether I could love all 3 answers equally. Whether I could say yes to the church kid and the tree kid and the kid who said, "I believe in kindness and also in aliens, and Mom, don't judge me." And whether saying yes to all of them meant I was finally saying yes to myself. And whether that was enough. And whether it would be enough tomorrow, and the day after, and the year after. When they got older and their answers got harder and their questions got sharper. And whether love could survive not having a single shared prayer to fall back on. And whether this strange little family of mixed smoke and trees and kindness and aliens could actually hold together without a single rule. And the answer came on a Sunday morning in April, in the most unexpected way, from the smallest person in the house. And it made me call my mother. And this time, I did not cry. 3 kids, 3 different yes to the universe. The Sunday morning everything became clear. Sam was 11, Lily was 9, and our youngest, Maya, was 6. And she walked into the kitchen in her pajamas with a missing front tooth and a very serious face and said, "Mom, I believe in pancakes." And I froze, spatula in hand, and said, "Pancakes?" And she said, "Yes. Because you make them every Sunday. And everyone is happy. And nobody fights. So that is God. That is the whole thing. Pancakes." And Greg, who was pouring coffee, snorted so hard he nearly choked. And I looked at this small gap-toothed philosopher in dinosaur pajamas and I thought, okay. Okay, that counts. That absolutely counts. And I made the pancakes. And nobody fought. And she was right. And here is where I need you to understand what happened over the next few months, because it was not a single moment. It was a slow unfolding, like watching 3 different flowers open in the same garden at completely different speeds. Lily, my eldest, started going to the little Methodist church on our street with her friend Emma. She liked the singing. She liked the candles. She came home one Sunday and said, "Mom, I think God is a song that doesn't end." And I said, "That is beautiful, baby." And I meant it. And I did not flinch. I did not reach for my incense and say, "But what about Ba Nuk Wai?" I just let the song be the song. And Sam, my quiet tree watcher, kept sitting in the backyard. Every evening. Cross-legged on the grass. Eyes closed. Breathing. And one night I went out and sat next to him and we did not talk for 10 minutes and then he opened his eyes and said, "The trees don't care what I believe, Mom. They just keep growing." I like that. And I said, "Yeah. I like that too." And I did not try to give him a prayer to go with the trees. I just let the trees be the trees. And Maya, my pancake theologian, added waffles to her belief system by Wednesday and by Friday she had expanded it to include being nice to the dog. And I let her. I let all of it. Because somewhere between the night Tyler said, "You don't have to know," and the night Lily asked to mix the smoke with the talking, something in me had finally, truly, physically loosened. Like a knot in my chest I had been clenching since I was 5 years old, standing beside my grandmother, being told, "This is yours, carry it. Do not drop it, do not change it, do not let it go." And I had carried it. Across an ocean. Across a marriage. Across 1,000 ESL vocabulary lists and awkward parent-teacher conferences and Thanksgiving dinners where I smiled too wide. And I was so tired of carrying. And letting Lily and Sam and Maya carry their own small, strange, beautiful versions did not mean I dropped mine. It meant I finally set it down gently on the table and said, "Here. This is mine. You can look. You can touch. You can walk away. You can come back. But you do not have to carry it for me." And that was the hardest English sentence I ever learned to say. Not the grammar. The meaning. The letting. And I picked up the phone that Sunday afternoon, after the pancakes, after the waffles, after Maya had declared the dog a sacred being. I called my mother. 9,000 miles. The time difference. The static. And she answered, and before she could ask, before she could worry, I said, in Vietnamese, slow and clear, "Me, tue no on. Con on. Con kong mat gi het. Con chi dang dat suong." Mom, the kids are fine. I am fine. I have lost nothing. I am just setting it down. And there was a long silence. And then my mother said, very softly, "Mine con. I hear you. Not I understand. Not I agree. Just, I hear you." And it was enough. It was more than enough. And I hung up and I walked outside and Greg was in the yard with Sam, sitting in the grass, not talking, just breathing together. And Lily was on the porch singing something off-key. And Maya was putting a tiny blanket over the sleeping dog. And I stood at the kitchen door and I watched all of them, my 4 people, my 3 small philosophers. My husband who prays in a language I still cannot fully understand, and I thought, this is it. This is the religion. This right here. This mess. This noise. This Tuesday. And I did not need a word for it. Not in English. Not in Vietnamese. Not in any language. I just needed to stand here and watch it and not fix it. And I stood there for a long time. And the sun went down. And nobody came inside. And I realized that was the happy ending. Not a grand one. Not a cinematic one. Just 5 people in a yard in Texas, not agreeing, not performing, not translating. Just being. And the next morning, I woke up early, before everyone, and I did something I had not done in a very long time. And it surprised even me. And it is the last thing I will tell you. And it is the thing that made me start this channel. And it is the reason you are watching this video right now. Freedom to believe is just love with the door open. That morning, before the sun came up, before Greg's coffee gurgled in the kitchen, before Lily's off-key singing and Sam's bare feet on grass and Maya's sacred dog stretched out on the tile, I walked into the backyard alone. Lit 1 stick of incense, pressed my palms together, and whispered my grandmother's prayer in Vietnamese. And then I did something new. I whispered it again. Slowly. In English. Broken, stumbling, imperfect English. I am grateful. I am here. I do not have to know everything. I just have to keep talking into the smoke. And I stood there, barefoot on the cold grass, and I cried. Not sad crying. The other kind. The kind where your body is finally putting down a suitcase it has been carrying for so long your arms forgot they were holding it. And I thought, this is how I learned English. Not from a textbook. Not from a classroom. From standing in a yard in Texas at 6 in the morning, translating my grandmother's silence into my own clumsy words, getting the grammar wrong. Getting the tenses wrong, saying I am grateful when maybe it should be I have been grateful. And deciding that the mistake did not erase the meaning. And that is what I want you to understand if you are watching this and your English is not where you want it to be. If you are sitting somewhere right now, tired, frustrated, thinking you will never sound like a native speaker, thinking your accent is a wall, thinking you started too late or you are too slow or the words will never feel like yours. They will. Not perfect. Not fast. But yours. The way this faith is mine. The way Greg's faith is his. The way Lily's song and Sam's trees and Maya's pancakes are theirs. You do not have to sound like someone else to be understood. You do not have to pray in someone else's language to be heard. You just have to keep showing up. Keep talking into the smoke. Keep making the pancakes. Keep sitting in the grass. Keep choosing the word that is close enough. Because freedom to believe, freedom to speak, freedom to be imperfect and still be loved, it is not a policy. It is not a school form. It is not a checkbox that says child's choice. It is just love with the door open. It is saying, I will be here when you come back. I will be here if you do not. And I will not close the door either way. And Greg came outside that morning with 2 mugs of coffee and he saw me, barefoot, incense smoke curling up, eyes red. And he did not ask what was wrong. He just handed me the mug and stood next to me and we watched the smoke go up and disappear into the Texas sky. And he said, "Good morning, babe." And I said, "Good morning." And the kids came thundering out the back door 3 minutes later, yelling about who got the window seat in the car. And Maya announced the dog needed pancakes too, and Sam was already cross-legged in the grass, and Lily was humming that song that doesn't end. And I stood there in the middle of all of it, my small loud imperfect family, and I thought, I made this. Not alone. Not perfectly. Not without crying in a garage or screaming broken English at 2 in the morning or calling my mother in tears. But I made this. And it is enough. And you, watching this, wherever you are, whatever language you are fumbling through, whatever faith or doubt or beautiful confusion you are carrying, you are enough too. You do not have to finish the sentence. You do not have to know. You just have to keep going. Slowly. Wrongly. Yours. And the door stays open. That is all for today. I will make many more videos like this in the future. Please subscribe so you do not miss them.